I wish I were a fish. Hey guys, this is Matt Powell.
No, it's not. It's me, Creaky.
So the Grand Canyon is probably one of my favorite places.
To jump off?
So the Grand Canyon is probably one of my favorite places to go.
Yeah, to go. That's what I meant. And why do you like to go there? And definitely not jump off. This is Matt Powell. I can't keep calling you This is Matt Powell. Too long. So from henceforth, I shall only refer to you as Matt, because it amuses me that someone would name their child after a thing that you wipe your muddy boots on. But I digress. Why do you like to go to the Grand Canyon, Matt?
To demonstrate that the flood of Noah is a fact.
But it isn't, and being at the Grand Canyon isn't going to change that. All being there will do is give you a spectacular backdrop, while still believing something that isn't a fact. It can't be a fact, because a fact is a thing that's known or proven to be true. And sadly for you and all other young Earth fantasists, your belief in something does not and cannot make it a fact. Only something that actually exists. Reality. For example, your fears have no basis in fact. Something is known to exist or to have happened can be considered a fact. Space travel is now a fact. A truth known by an actual experience or observation. Scientists gather facts about lots of different things, but not about a big wooden boat filled with every animal on Earth.
Because the Grand Canyon is where the geologic column is. And the geologic column is where evolution is based from.
Well. Wrong again, Matt. Evolution is based on the change and characteristics of a species over several generations. And the geologic column is a representation used in geology and its subfield stratigraphy to describe the vertical location of rock units in a particular area. So no, evolution is not based on that at all. It's just a diagram used in educational text to illustrate how things have evolved.
And they say you have Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Archaeozoic ages in the Grand Canyon, and they say that this all represents millions of years of supposed geologic time where one layer slowly formed upon another. But the truth is that we find no erosion, virtually no erosion marks between the layers. If you have a layer forming and then it takes a long time for the next layer to form, you would expect to find erosion if you were to break the layers apart.
Really? So it isn't that the canyon was carved by the Colorado River then? As well as wind and rain? Wait a second. All those things cause erosion. Are you manipulating things to fit your narrative again, Matt? The Grand Canyon is only there because of erosion, you dipshit. The fact that it's there at all is all the evidence of erosion anyone would need. Well, anyone who isn't frantically trying to make things fit the story that the Earth is only a few thousand years old anyway.
But when you break certain of the layers apart, you'll often find that there are water ripples connecting each of the layers.
What? There are water ripples at the Grand Canyon? Are we talking about the same Grand Canyon? I'm talking about the Grand Canyon that is perhaps the best example of a water-carved canyon. I think what you meant to say is that the Grand Canyon was caused by water, and more specifically, water erosion.
So what that means is that it was laid down by water. And sedimentary rock, which the Grand Canyon is even made out of, is defined as rock that was laid down by water.
Come on, now you're just making things up, Matt. Not sure why I find that so surprising, but anyway. Sedimentary rock, by definition, is rock that was formed through the deposition and solidification of sediment, especially sediment transported by water, like the water that formed the Grand Canyon maybe? Sedimentary rocks are often deposited in layers and frequently contain fossils, so I can see why a young Earth creationist would need to make up their own definition. It's because the real one is, well, it's real, isn't it? And no young Earth creationist needs their time wasted by real things.
So whenever people say the phrase Grand Canyon, it literally is defined as sedimentary rock, which is defined as rock that was laid down by water. So the name Grand Canyon literally means canyon that was caused by a flood, layers that were laid down by water.
Well, at least he sort of acknowledged that it was caused by water, but it wasn't Noah's flood. Because remember earlier I said only things that actually exist, blah blah blah? Yeah, Noah's flood didn't happen because there is no evidence that it did. Sorry, I withdraw and rephrase, Your Honor. There is no real evidence showing that it did. It was actually a one-armed Civil War veteran. Not sure that him only having one arm has got any relevance, but there we go. And his name was John Wesley Powell. Wait, Powell? Why does that name sound so familiar? Ah, yes, Matt Powell, silly me. But John Wesley Powell coined and popularized the name Grand Canyon in 1869. Previously, it had been called the Big Canyon, which is factually correct, I know. I mean, it looks pretty big to me, but don't take my word for it. I've spent the last 30 years trying to convince Mrs. Blinder that this is 12 inches, which is probably why she's not very good at measuring stuff.
Now, if certain of these layers were exposed for millions of years, we would expect to find animal holes between the layers. I mean, if you have a layer forming and then it takes a long time for the next layer to form, you would expect to find animal holes between the layers of animals that lived during those supposed ages that burrowed down in those layers during those ages.
Right, I'll keep this response short and to the point. Dead animals don't burrow. They're only there because they died there.
And so we don't find that at all. There is no animal holes whatsoever, no bioturbation. And if certain of these layers were exposed for millions of years, you would expect to find root remains of plants and trees that grew down into the ground and put their roots down into the ground. But again, we don't find that because those layers were all formed at the same time in one event.
Okay, well, I'm not sure what roots are, but there have been leaf fossils excavated at the Grand Canyon. And in Wales, trees have leaves. Just a thought it might be worth pointing out because, you know, facts. What the hell is a root?
Now, to answer an objection that I've heard from Bill Nye, he stated that all of the clams were at the bottom layers, all the lizards were closer to the bottom, and all the mammals were closer to the top, and the birds were up at the top layers. So he says that you see how we evolved over time.
Let me just stop you there, Matt. Bill Nye is not saying that we evolved from clams, so don't even think about it.
But the truth is that that's simply how the flood sorted it.
So an intelligent flood then? Water that is capable of sorting out the things it washes over. Based on what, though? That's the real question here.
Based on their buoyancy. And so, of course, the flood waters would put all the heavy stuff on the bottom, not so heavy stuff closer to the bottom, less heavy stuff closer to the top, and then birds at the top, of course, because they're the last ones to die. And so when they see, well, you see how we evolved over time.
But that isn't what they're saying, is it, you Kent Hovind wannabe? I cannot believe that there are actually people in the world stupid enough to believe anything this clown tells them. Everything he says is so disingenuous and so carefully crafted to fit his childlike beliefs, it baffles me. Matt, you're a con man, and not a very good one, because everything you say is so easy to disprove. But still a con man, you copy what Mr. Hovind, because a certificate from a shack in the desert does not make you a real doctor. You copy everything he says almost verbatim, because you're too stupid to come up with any of this nonsense by yourself. And I fully expect another episode of Whack an Atheist after you see this and go running off to him, because the mean old Welshman called out your BS again. Get a grip. Start living in reality. You may even enjoy it.
Now, another reason that we know that all of the layers were deposited in one event is because we find trilobite trails before we actually find the trilobite fossil, millions of years before. And so what that proves is that when the floodwaters were coming in and mud was being deposited, these trilobites were trying to work their way up through the mud, and they died in the upper layers, not able to outrun the mud.
Now, I don't like stating the obvious, but can anyone else see the flaw in what he just said? All I want to add to this is that trilobites went extinct 250 million years ago. Is 250 million more than 6,000? I'm never sure. Maths isn't my strong point.
You find salamander tracks and amphibian tracks 15 million years before you actually find the actual salamander that made the tracks. I mean, let that sink in. You find trails of all sorts of different animals before you actually find the animal that made the trail, supposedly 15 or 20 million years before the animal that actually made the trail that was found in the upper layers.
And all that shows is that there were salamanders roaming the earth 50 million years prior. This stuff isn't hard, you just have to look it up. All the information is there. And once again, dead animals find it really difficult to leave tracks, man.
Charles Lyle said that his goal in life, and he was the one who invented the geologic column time scale, He said that his goal in life was to free the sciences of Moses. So Charles Lyle just hated God, he hated the Bible.
Yay, you got something right. It was Charles Lyle. Not sure hate is a word I'd use, but yes, he did in fact say, men of superior talent, that's not you by the way, Matt, who thought for themselves, again, not you, and were not blinded by authority, like the Bible, blinded by the Bible is you. Lyle said that one of his goals was to free science from Moses. Well, at least we can understand now why you dislike old Charlie boy, because we all know that a young Earth Creationist view is that anyone that doesn't believe the same as them is wrong, and doomed to go to hell because we're all terrible people.
And so he made up a complete and utter fairy tale.
No, I'm not having that. Charles Lyle did not write the Bible.
But if we look all over the world, we see tons of flood evidence. We find dinosaurs, a T-Rex in particular that I could think of, that was found under 50 feet of sediment. And if you look at the fossil, it died in a position that it was gasping for air. It had suffocated to death. And that's how it died, and it was preserved under 50 feet of mud. And let me ask you a question.
Ask away. But I have an observation to make first. Why is it that you insist on showing things like dinosaurs, which clearly demonstrate that the Earth is billions of years old, and try to prove that the Earth is 6,000 years old? How does that help you? It helps me because it demonstrates that you couldn't find your way out of a 6x4 room if the door was open. But how does it help your argument? Okay, so let's hear your question then, Matt.
What would cause a T-Rex, a fully grown T-Rex dinosaur, to be engulfed and encapsulated under 50 feet of mud and dying in a suffocation position?
I don't know, maybe he got in a fight with a bigger dinosaur. A Ninjasaurus, maybe. No, they were a thing, look it up. They were like the Jackie Chan of the late Cretaceous period. Maybe it was so badly injured it just lay there gasping for breath and then died in that position. And as dinosaur undertakers weren't that common 66 million years ago, that's where he laid until eventually nature did his thing and buried him. You're assuming that he was buried alive, Matt, which is a problem, because he probably wasn't. That came much, much later.
The only way to explain that is the flood of Noah. There is no other option. See, that's what people need to understand, is that when they discount the global flood, they're taking away from science. They're actually denying science. And a lot of times they do it ignorantly, but there are some who do it willfully ignorantly.
Does willfully ignorant mean you do it on purpose? I am going against everything you say just to appear stupid on purpose, Matt. And definitely not because everything I say is based on what actually happened, and that's why you don't like what I say.
Now, when you point these things out about the fossils that are found out of place and the fact that you find tracks before you actually find the animals, 15 million, 20 million, even 30 or 40 million before finding the animals that supposedly existed after those tracks existed in the layers, when you point this out to evolutionists, typically what they do is they will say, well, we radiometrically date the Grand Canyon rock layers. And so radiometric dating proves that the Grand Canyon is millions of years old and we evolved over time, and that it represents millions of years of time. Well, the problem with that is
that radiometric dating is not useful for determining the age of sedimentary rocks. And the fact that you seem to think that it is shows just how little you know about the subject. Now, it is a very useful tool, but of course it's got limits. The material being dated has to have measurable amounts of isotopes. Radiometric dating can be done on some materials, not all, just some. So I doubt that unless you found someone that studies geochronology that is as stupid as you, they probably have never said that at all.
That radiometric rock dating has never worked even once for rocks of known age. I mean, think about it. In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, and it created igneous rock that flowed down the side of the mountain, and some creation scientists took and tested this rock, this fresh rock that was less than 10 years old, about 10 years after it had erupted. And so it was the worst volcano in US history. Well, they sent the rock samples that were less than 10 years old to 5 different laboratories known as the geochron laboratories, all of our best. And so they dated these rocks.
Creation scientists. Now you're being silly, Matt. And imagine that. The only information I can find out about what Matt just said is on creationist websites. Strange, that.
And the ages that they came back with were astounding. The samples came back as follows. The first one, 340,000 years. The second, 350,000 years. The third, 900,000 years. One came back as 7 million years old. Now this is the dating method that they're saying is reliable, and we can date the crust of the Earth using this method. Another one came back as 2.8 million years old. So here's the thing, those are vastly different ages. So if they can't even get a consistent date on rocks of known age, how are we supposed to trust this radiometric dating process for rocks of unknown age?
Well, I completely agree. It's far more sensible to trust a book that was written about 2,700 years ago. Now, the first biblical stories were passed down orally, so you know that means they're accurate, and they were only written down later by various different authors. Most biblical scholars believe that the book of Genesis was the first one to be written down, and the fact that it's a storybook consisting of the ramblings of men thousands of years ago and couldn't possibly have been misinterpreted or misunderstood makes it far more reliable than any of the scientific discoveries made throughout history. What do you think? Let's talk about it down in the comments. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Alright, watch this next. But before you do, make sure you subscribe. By order of the Creaky Blinder.